Hello, and a warm welcome to you wherever you may be on behalf of the Merchant Adventurers of York to this, the 11th year of our Arts Discovery Talk, which we have presented annually in partnership with York University. Normally, you'd be hearing tonight's talk in the majestic surroundings of the hall. But sadly, this year that is not possible due to COVID. So in this virtual presentation, I would like to give you a very short introduction to the hall and the company. The hall itself was built between 1357 and 1361 for a religious fraternity dedicated to our Lord Jesus Christ and the Blessed Virgin Mary, which was later renamed the Company of Merchant Adventurers of the City of York. It is unique because it is the oldest surviving semi-timbered guildhall in Britain, with its three principal rooms still intact. More remarkable still, it has remained all this time in the ownership of the organisation that built it 660 years ago. The building took 4 years to construct and has 3 main rooms designed to serve the basic functions of a medieval guild. The Great Hall on the upper level was used for business, for meetings, and for the company's social events, and still is. The Undercroft was used for charitable purposes as a hospital or almshouse to help the sick and the poor. The third room, the chapel, was and is for religious services. The company has a long and prestigious history in promoting enterprise and commercial venturing, business risk-taking. A merchant adventurer was quite simply a merchant who risked his or her own capital in pursuit of trade, both here in England, but also around the ports of the North Sea and the Baltic. Today, our membership of men and women is taken from a broad church of entrepreneurs, businessmen, academics, and professionals. They have a common set of values through their fellowship, preserving the hall and its contents, and pursuing their collective ambition of helping business enterprise and education. Over time, the company has actively campaigned on issues that affect York and its community. It was, for example, the force behind the founding of the York Chamber of Commerce in 1895 and also championed the establishment of the University of York in 1962. Today, the company maintains its hall as a museum dedicated to the education of the public and also makes it available for private hire for wedding receptions, dinners, and under normal circumstances, lectures and talks like the one you will hear this evening. If you aren't a regular visitor to this wonderful building, may I recommend you pay us a visit and enjoy a relaxing cup of coffee in the gardens or inside the building, admiring some of the pieces, such as the oak evidence chest, which you will have seen advertising tonight's talk. Bought in 1430, for most of the last 600 years, it has held all the important documents of the company. This leads me, therefore, on to tonight's talk, and without further ado, I will hand over to Professor Charlie Jeffrey, Vice-Chancellor of the University, to introduce Professor Sarah Rees Jones, our speaker.
Thank you so much, David. It's a great pleasure to add to your welcome at this Merchant Adventurers Arts Discovery event. Organised jointly by the University and the Merchant Adventurers, these lectures are a platform from which to inform the people of York of important discoveries in arts and humanities made by academics at the university. This lecture is part of York Ideas, the University of York's year-long series of events to educate, entertain and inspire. This culminates in York's Festival of Ideas in June each year. As a university for public good, based in a city of ideas and innovation, our commitment is to engage with as diverse a set of audiences as we can, and to do what we can to widen participation in education. Of course, this has been a particularly challenging year for us. Much as we'd love to be in the wonderful hall of the Merchant Adventurers, we're delighted nonetheless that we can still bring you this lecture in an online format. We won't be able to meet you in person and give you an opportunity to meet our speaker as we normally would, but we hope that you'll enjoy the talk all the same. On which note, it's my great pleasure to be introducing Professor Sarah Rees Jones. Sarah is Professor of Medieval History in the Department of History and the Centre for Medieval Studies at the University of York. She's an eminent historian, but she's also, and I think this is so important, a keen advocate for sharing historical research with the general public. In her time at York, she's twice been the director of the Centre for Medieval Studies, a globally renowned centre for postgraduate training in its field. And she's also twice been director of the Institute for the Public Understanding of the Past and established the first MA in Public History at the university in 2012. She's the author of York, The Making of a City, 1068 to 1350, and co-author of the Historic Towns Atlas of the City of York, which was published in 2015. Working with partners in the city has been the key aspect to Sarah's work, and these have included the York Archaeological Trust, York Minster, and the York Museums Trust. Sarah currently leads a major Research Council project on the administrative records of the Archbishops of York, called The Northern Way, the Archbishops of York and the North of England, 1304 to 1405. Sarah's work is just one example of how the university's expertise and our wonderful city come together in creative combination. And we're honoured, as ever, to be working in partnership with the company of merchant adventurers in giving a platform to that creativity. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Sarah Rees Jones.
Good evening. The Borthwick Institute for Archives was founded in 1953 as part of the local campaign which ultimately led to the successful foundation of the University of York. At the heart of the Borthwick's original collections are one of the largest, oldest and most detailed surviving collections of records anywhere in Europe that relate to the administration of the Church in the Middle Ages. That is, the administrative records of the Archbishops of York. And you can see these in a photograph from 1953 in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. And yet, of course, this is just one of 4 large archives of medieval records kept in the city of York. The others are the archives of the civic government of York, kept at York Explore, which you can see in the top right-hand corner of your screen. The archives of the Dean and Chapter, kept in York Minster Library, and of course the archives of the York Merchant Adventurers, kept in the Hall of the Merchant Adventurers in Fossgate. And beyond that, there are the vast riches of the collections of the National Archives, indicated in the top left of your screen here, and of both regional county record offices and private archive collections. Indeed, the surviving volume of historical records for the history of the medieval North is so vast that it can scarcely be estimated, but each of these archives contain thousands of items waiting to be discovered, and within them there are literally millions of stories from the medieval past yet to be uncovered. This archival heritage, I argue, deserves to be recognised and enjoyed alongside the great architectural and archaeological heritages of our region. Yet to a large extent they remain hidden from sight, locked away for safekeeping, and difficult to access because the records are written in unfamiliar languages, in Latin, in French or Middle English, and in unfamiliar forms of handwriting. So in this lecture, I want to suggest first why this archival heritage is of both great and indeed timely interest, and secondly, how we might try to widen public access to it today. So all the records in these archives are administrative records, that is, they are records generated by the processes of governing institutions, both large and small. And in the 14th century, there were two main structures to these governing institutions. On the one hand, you had the royal government, based in the centre in the royal courts at Westminster, and extending down through a structure of counties, wapentakes or hundreds, to townships and villages at a grassroots level. And on the other hand, you had the structures of ecclesiastical government, headed at the top in England in the central courts of the Archbishops of Canterbury and York, and then extending down through a structure of diocesan officials, deaneries, and eventually parishes, again at a grassroots level. And in both these two institutions, the church and the state, there was a real proliferation and growth in the generation of records kept and archived from the decades, around 1300, and an even larger growth after 1350. And we can ask really two questions about how this was happening. One is to point out that there was a real increase in government activity from the top down. Royal government, for example, raising taxes for new wars, first with Scotland and later with France, created a whole new system of administration that was reaching much more effectively into the lives of ordinary people. Secondly, within the church also, from the later 13th century, a greater concern to enforce the moral codes of conduct, if you like, of the church that were promulgated internationally through the papal councils, resulted in a much greater bureaucracy of record keeping. And both these things together resulted in what we might describe as a bureaucratic revolution, the results of which for historians is that we have much more material to understand daily life in the 14th century and later than for any previous century. So these are the records that allow us to study the arrival and impact and reception of the plague in the north. But it's worth pointing out just before we move on that there were some institutions that stood a little free of this structure. They were still subject to the jurisdiction of church and state, but often had individually negotiated relationships with it, and also exercised jurisdiction over their own tenants. And these were the estates of some of the greater nobility, of some religious institutions, such as the great monasteries or the Dean and Chapter of York Minster, and of some larger cities and towns, like the city of York itself. And in our period, as we shall see, there were also some new institutions developing, collectives, associations of men and women, whether as religious fraternities or craft guilds, and they also were very much subject to church and state, but were developing their own sets of records that gave them some autonomy within those structures as well. As a result of this bureaucratic revolution, by 1400 there was scarcely an aspect of daily life that did not fall within this administrative net of written rules and accounting procedures. Innovations in both local and national government, through both legislation and practice, affected, among other things, the regulation of wages and prices and the organisation of manufacturing and trade, the regulation of apprenticeships and training, and the organisation of mobility and the job market. There were new regulations defining the difference between natives and aliens, and therefore policing immigration. There were considerable new innovations in the invention of new direct and indirect taxes, and changes in practice that substantially affected the nature of property law. On the secular side of government, there were also changes to political constitutions, who could participate in governing institutions through elections, and who had access to government by petitioning, for example. Over on the church side, there were changes in the management of family law, particularly the regulation of adultery and fornication, in the ways in which inheritances could be recorded and disposed of, in the management of debt cases, in defamation, and in trials for blasphemy and heresy. In fact, although I've laid out this slide as though the operation of the courts of the state and church were separate, in fact there was a considerable overlap and interchange between the two. But what you can see is that most aspects of daily working life and many aspects of family life were directly regulated and subject to written record by the end of the 14th century. The expansion of government bureaucracy therefore gives historians much greater insight into everyday life than was true for any previous century. But we shouldn't only see this bureaucratic revolution as a top-down process. There was also a very strong bottom-up aspect to it in terms of growing demand from numbers of ordinary people for more written processes to give them greater security in different aspects of their lives. And we can use as an example of this the growth of the institution which led to the foundation of the Merchant Adventurers Company in York. This first appears in the records as a religious fraternity of wealthy mercers and merchants in York that was dedicated to our Lord Jesus Christ and the Blessed Virgin Mary. They acquired pieces of property in Fossgate, and you can see one of their written title deeds to that property here, and then in 1357 acquired a written royal licence to construct a new hospital and hall on land just off Fossgate. So here's the building that they constructed with its hospital dedicated to Holy Trinity on the ground floor and a meeting hall for the fraternity in the space above. By the 15th century, this fraternity had evolved into the Guild of the Mercers of York, representing their trading interests, and then in the 16th century, by royal charter, it was incorporated into a company of merchant adventurers. So in all kinds of ways, you could say that the adoption of bureaucracy was one of the foundation stones upon which the stability and longevity of this institution was built. Here you can see their archive chest, a wonderful example of a surviving medieval archive chest, which the Guild bought shortly after 1400, probably second-hand, for a few shillings. And it was the records that they kept in that archive chest, their deeds to property, their charters of incorporation, their written lists of members, their written list of rules, their copies of court proceedings through which they enforced those rules. It was really those records in many ways which gave their institution solidity and sustainability, if you like. And the way in which this institution profited from the use of bureaucracy was reproduced in certain private lives as well. The growing ability in the 14th century to make a will, for example, to bequeath property to friends and relations, was another type of writing that ordinary people very much aspired to and wanted to create and have the courts register and recognise for them. So we can see the bureaucratic revolution then to some extent as a bottom-up process as well as a top-down process. And maybe in thinking about the bureaucratic revolution, the best analogy that we can use is with the internet in our own age and the impact that has had on society, government and the economy as an engine that is driving change, that is the result of top-down processes, whether led by government agencies or multinational corporations, but also thrives because of bottom-up demand, the popular use of the internet. So we can think of the bureaucratic revolution then, not so much as the end result of processes of government, but in its own right as an engine which began to drive change in society. And another aspect of that change you can see in the slide here in terms of the new buildings that were created by the York Merchant Adventurers and by the City of York Council to accommodate these new bureaucratic processes. The hall in Fossgate with its council chamber inserted in the 15th century and its archive room, and the new Guildhall constructed just off Coney Street by the Ouse in the 15th century, both creating spaces for these recorded meetings, spaces for more private discussions of the ruling officials of the crafts, and spaces for them to write and keep their archives. If the 14th century was a time of bureaucratic innovation that fundamentally changed society, it was also a century in which local people experienced many traumatic events, not least the Black Death, which arrived in England in 1348 and in the north in 1349, resulting in a reduction in the country's population ultimately of perhaps 30 to 40%, as bubonic plague became endemic. However, so far as the north was concerned, the plague was but one of a number of crises that afflicted local communities. Earlier in the century, a great European famine, the result of appalling weather associated with major shifts in the climate and resulting in failed harvests and rampant cattle diseases, reduced and enfeebled the population. And then more locally, there was the problem of recurrent invasions of small marauding armies from Scotland, still then a fiercely independent country, who pressed ever more daringly further south into Yorkshire and destroyed all in their path. Neither was the north of England ever particularly quiescent to a royal government that was based primarily in the south. Northern magnates and local communities joined in armed revolt against Edward II that ended in the Northerners' defeat at the Battle of Boroughbridge in 1322 and the death of their leader, Thomas Earl of Lancaster, around whom a posthumous cult developed in the north. And they rose again against Henry IV in 1405, leading to the unprecedented trial of the then Archbishop of York, Richard Scrope, for treason, and his execution at the command of the king outside the walls of York. These revolts, of course, were also fueled by discontent among mercantile, manufacturing and farming communities over innovations in the royal regulation of trade, the imposition of new forms of taxation, and generally the neglect of northern interests. Indeed, the north-south divide was already fully in place. Northern communities, by virtue of their relatively remote location, were always on the whole less able to prosper from trading connections with Europe and access to the centres of national government than were communities in the south. So, having set the scene about the Bureaucratic Revolution and the 14th century crisis in the medieval north, I'm now going to turn to consider how we can use those resources and context to understand the arrival and impact of the Black Death from 1349. I'm going to take this in two parts. First, what we can find in the records about northern responses to plague, and second, to speculate how and why the impact of plague might have resulted in the expansion of those archival records. So first of all, what was the Black Death? The latest research suggests that the plague that we now refer to as the Black Death, which was absolutely not a contemporary medieval term, was one in a long global series of epidemics of bubonic plague caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis that extended over millennia, but resulted in a cluster of episodes in the centuries between 1200 and 1700 that centred on Central Asia, the Mediterranean and Europe. And you can see on this slide here, which was created by Monica Green, an American historian specialising in the scientific history of the plague, how there are at least three different pandemics. Plague kept appearing and reappearing around the European and North African world over and over again. Plague spread and was repeatedly reintroduced between Asia and Europe along trade and pilgrimage routes. And what you can see here on the slide is an aggregation of many individual studies of trade and pilgrimage routes in particular regions of the medieval world, aggregated and turned into a network. And the density of that network shows how very interconnected Asia, Europe and North African were by the 14th century. Yorkshire, as you can see, is on the very edge of that network. So we can imagine plague, as well as people, goods and ideas, travelling along these routes and reaching England as one of its last destinations. It was carried by fleas, We now think these were as likely to be human parasites as rodent parasites. And we also now think, contrary to what used to be suggested, that this infection spread along land routes as much as it did by sea routes. And indeed, that is borne out by one of the first pieces of evidence we have for the Black Death in the north of England, which is the first instruction for the creation of a new plague cemetery, which was to be built at Newark in Nottinghamshire, and the order for this was given on the 15th of May 1349. Clear evidence then of the infection spreading from the south of England towards the north via the Great North Road, what we now call the A1, and Newark being an important stopping place on that route. But we also have suggestions that plague entered Yorkshire by more than one route, and that it also probably came via east coast ports such as Whitby and Hull. And I'll go on to read you in the next slide an extract from a chronicle that describes that. Meaux Abbey was located near the town of Kingston upon Hull, with its major port, and this is how the first year of plague is described in its chronicle. In March 1349, an earthquake was felt throughout England. Our monks of Meaux were at vespers when they were thrown from their choir stalls by the earthquake and sent sprawling to the ground. The earthquake was quickly followed by the pestilence. Abbot Hugh died in the great pestilence, along with 32 monks and lay brothers. Within the month of August, the new abbot, 22 monks, and 6 lay brothers died, of whom the abbot and 5 monks were buried together on a single day. When the pestilence ceased, only 10 monks and no lay brothers were left alive out of the original 50 monks and lay brothers. We have plenty of evidence, then, that plague arrived in the north of England in the spring of 1349. As Thomas Stubbs, a chronicler writing in York, wrote, on the 31st of December 1348, the River Ouse flooded and burst its banks at the bridge towards Micklegate, a state of affairs which persisted until Lent, and after this, at around Ascension Tide, the 21st of May 1349, the mortality began in the city of York and raged until the feast of St. James the Apostle, which was the 25th of July. Of course, when I was writing this, I couldn't help but think of the similarity to the turn of events in the spring of 2020. First of all, we were met with tremendous floods and then with a great pestilence. But of course, in the Middle Ages, these events were interpreted slightly differently. It's true, however, that in many early reports of the arrival of plague, we can see that plague was associated with other exceptional natural events, in which contemporaries took a scientific interest, events such as earthquakes and floods, that were of interest because they were testimonies to the power of divine creation, but of interest as natural phenomena in their own right too. However, a less familiar perspective for us is the way in which these events were also interpreted as divine punishments for sin. Within the Christian faith, the only faith in northern England at this time, there was a constant apprehension that the temptations of the material world would so ensnare the clergy and the laity that they would be prevented from achieving eternal spiritual bliss in the life hereafter. Much of the immediate reaction to the plague was therefore also cast in these terms. Indeed, in an extraordinary document that survives in one of the Archbishops' registers now in the Borthwick Institute, we have the first known reference to the plague in the whole of England. In a set of instructions issued by Archbishop William Zouche on the 28th of July 1348, that is months before the plague arrived in the north, he wrote that there can be no one who does not know, since it is now public knowledge, how great a mortality, pestilence, and infection of the air are now threatening various parts of the world, and especially England, and this is surely caused by the sins of men, who, while enjoying good times, forget that such things are the gifts of God. And he went on to instruct that devout and solemn liturgical processions were to be held every Wednesday and Friday in his cathedral church, and in every college, monastery and parish church throughout the diocese, and that a special prayer was to be said daily at Mass for allaying the pestilence. While this was the first instruction to hold intercessions against the plague, it was certainly not the last. Such instructions were repeated frequently throughout the remainder of the century and into the next, as plague epidemics recurred. Nor was the holding of liturgical processions an innovation in the face of this disaster. Earlier in the 14th century, processions were regularly ordered to allay the threat posed by invading Scots. So in 1348, the Church simply adapted this common practice to a new threat, the threat of plague. And by the end of the 14th century, all these threats to life were commonly wrapped up into a single list of disasters, usually starting with the threat of the Scots and ending with the threat of the plague. Among the more practical responses to the plague was the licensing of new cemeteries for the burial of the dead, a responsibility of diocesan officials and therefore recorded in the registers of the Archbishops of York. You can see here a map of the plague cemeteries that have been identified so far. This is a fairly new project which we've only just started and have far from completed. So the map, I think, is going to look very different when we have finished. I think at the moment what it's showing you particularly is plague cemeteries licensed in 1349 for chapels at ease in parts of the county where parishes were very, very large, and sometimes parishioners had to walk even 20 miles to carry their dead for burial in the parish church. So a number of these plague cemeteries made burial much quicker and easier. In other cases, like the plague cemeteries that you can see there in York and Beverley, it's no doubt a response to the scale of the mortality overwhelming existing burial grounds. The discovery of new cemeteries is exciting, both because it enables us to track and trace the spread of the plague in the 14th century, but also because potentially further down the line we're identifying sites of plague burials that could perhaps be subjected to forensic archaeological analysis in much the same way that plague cemeteries excavated in London recently as a result of the Crossrail excavations have been, and so generate new kinds of information about the impact of plague on the local population. Some of these plague cemeteries survived and continued in use as regular cemeteries right the way down to the present day. That's clearly the case at St Mary in Stainburn to the west of Harrogate. But in other cases, they seem to have been more ephemeral. And we've just recently discovered a plague cemetery at Thorpe Street, a tiny hamlet on the A1079, not so far from Pocklington. And that certainly doesn't seem to have survived. Indeed, at the moment, we have no idea where it was. So if you know anything about that, please do get in touch. The volume of records surviving for the 14th century is so great that for over a century now, historians have been using it to try to create quantitative data about the chronology, scale and impact of plague mortality. The sources that we can draw on include data relating to the appointment of clergy and the registration of the wills of the laity, new endowments of prayers for the dead, the value of rental properties, lists of admissions to associations such as the Freedom of York, tax assessments and lists of taxpayers, a large amount of material in all archives relating to wages and prices, new rules relating to the regulation, particularly of urban environments, and provision that's made for the charitable care of the sick. And of course, the construction of that hospital in Fossgate in 1357 is a major indicator of growing lay concern about care of the sick in the immediate aftermath of the plague. But returning to the quantitative data, I can't do this full justice, but let me outline some of the conclusions that have been drawn. And indeed, this is an area where we're continuing to work and come up with new ideas and new material. So estimates have been made, for example, of the percentage of clergy killed by the plague rising as high as 40% in the plague years. But we are also able to look at the geographical distribution of the plague by locating the places of those people who registered wills. These wills also show peaks in interest in the years that the plague struck. A peak, for example, in 1348 as well as 1349, showing how the laity were anticipating, fearing, if you like, for their deaths as the plague moved towards them. We're also of course, able to identify peaks in mortality that suggest the sequence of epidemics, whereas other data, like, for example, the citizens of Hull demanding new processes for the registration of wills in 1362 because of the large number of people dying, also helps us pin down that chronological sequence of particularly large epidemics, not only in 1349, but also afterwards. And some data allows us to go further than that and trace the seasonality of mortality. There's particularly good data in York Minster archives, for example, relating to endowing prayers for the dead, which gives the date of their death. And there we can see that in 1362, there's a real shift in peak mortality from the summer months to the winter months, indicating that the plague has become pneumonic in form and is spreading as a respiratory disease, which was much more fatal. Going beyond the plague itself, historians have also tried to look at what the impact of this high mortality might have been on the economy and on society by looking at changes in the occupational structure of local communities and their sex ratios, finding, for example, after the plague, that perhaps more women were moving from the countryside and living in towns such as York. And we're also able to think about what the impact of the plague was on the economy, on wages and prices. A very short, sharp period of high inflation immediately after 1349 was followed by something of a lull, and then a longer period of more gentle inflation between the mid-1360s and 1380s in all kinds of wages and prices, and indeed, perhaps surprisingly, in rents, particularly in towns. And that may be, of course, a result of high mortality, reducing the availability of labour, but there's probably also a monetary explanation. Currency in those days was based on silver bullion. With fewer people around, there was simply more bullion in circulation per capita for a short period, and that may underpin that period of inflation between the 1360s and the 1380s. But we also find more personal insights into the fear engendered by living in a pandemic. Here on the left here we have the case of Adam de Brantingham, a chaplain who's ordered to serve as a parochial chaplain in the Church of Hotham in the East Riding at a suitable salary, or to show why he shouldn't be compelled to do so. And this follows a complaint by his parish priest that the plague has ravished his parish and taken away all of his chaplains, and that Brantingham has refused to serve, to the manifest danger of the souls of his parishioners. So there's somebody running away from plague, if you like, and perhaps even more evocatively, we find the case of Isabella, the wife of John Dogmersfield in Nottinghamshire, who took a vow during the time of pestilence to consume only bread and water every Saturday for the rest of her life. And 8 years later, in February 1357, she's still living by that vow, but is now suffering from weakness of body and other infirmities. So the Church instructs her to abandon her vow and to let it be performed by somebody else in her place. So these are the kinds of new insights we're finding as we work carefully through the Archbishops' registers for this period, which have never been published, and which perhaps give us a real personal insight into emotional responses to plague, with which we can very much sympathise. We can also see that the experience of plague had an impact on the Bureaucratic Revolution itself, increasing demand for the use of writing and written procedures in administration. And we can see this particularly in the archives of the city of York, which increased significantly in scope after the plague with the addition of a number of new categories of record. And among these in particular are two great registers, known as the York Memorandum Books, that were started in the 1370s as a response to changes in society and government that were the result of the plague, and that between them provide a kind of Bible of civic administrative practice in the later Middle Ages. The memorandum books contain all kinds of legal and financial records, but they also contain records that tell us more about administrative practice in the period, little snippets of history, for example. And what you have here is a senior clerk taking the trouble to write a long explanation of how numbering systems work, essential if you're to do your accounts properly, and in particular on this folio, explaining how you translate from the Roman numerals that were commonly used at the time to the new Arabic numeral system that was just coming into use, and of which, of course, is the numbering system that we use today. This is actually an extraordinary early record of interest in numeracy and numbering systems, and deserves to be much more widely known than it is. Another innovation was the greater use of English in the writing of records, as governing institutions sought to reach out to wider constituencies. And here you have three important examples of this. First, there is the Lay Folks' Catechism, or a detailed account of the essentials of the Christian faith, copied in both Latin and English into an Archbishop's register in 1369. And second, in the middle, is a list of the working regulations of a craft guild, in this case one manufacturing harnesses for horses, that are written in very strong Yorkshire English, the everyday language of that craft, and brought for copying into the city's York Memorandum Books, which gradually filled with the ordinances of many such crafts. And finally, there is the earliest text of the York Mystery Plays, written in English by a town clerk in the 1470s in order to check the performance of the players. So in many ways we can see the impact of plague contributing to a widening participation in bureaucratic culture, both through voluntary participation but also through compulsion. There were limits to this widening, however. Literacy was not essential to participate, but a certain standing in the community was. The ability to find people to stand pledge for you in court, or to act as witnesses and executors to your will. The ability to pay entry fines and fees in order to join fraternities or become a freeman of the city. The very poor, therefore, such as labourers and migrants who moved regularly in search of work, or those who were dependent on piecemeal employment, such as many unmarried women, all of these kinds of people were not only less able to benefit from the expanding bureaucratic culture, but by contrast were even more firmly excluded and marginalised by it, as written rules began to proliferate about the regulation of poverty and also the regulation of migrants, foreigners and vagrants. Indeed, vagrancy is a word that's recorded in English for the first time in this period. In many ways, then, the bureaucratic revolution combined with the plague brought more middling sorts of people into active and even voluntary participation in bureaucratic culture, but in doing so it widened the gulf between them and the poor. Indeed, you could go further and say that the bureaucratic revolution of the 14th century cemented the inequalities and marginalisation of certain groups in society that laid the foundation for the politics of identity around class, sex and race that have been such a feature of the modern era. So, if the bureaucratic revolution of the 14th century was in some ways as excluding socially as it was including, how can we open that archival legacy up to the widest possible public audiences today, given all the many barriers that stand in their way? One essential part of the solution is certainly to embrace the digital. More and more archives are making high-quality digital images of their collections and making them available to the public online, so ensuring global access, but safeguarding the original manuscripts. And you can see two examples on the screen here. On the left, thousands and thousands of original medieval records from our national archives that are available from a website hosted by the University of Houston. And on the right, a smaller initiative based in Durham, making the medieval collections of the archives of Durham Cathedral similarly online as digital images. Of course, that still leaves the big problem of how to read these original documents without having training in Latin and paleography. I am convinced that in the future there will be solutions to these problems using applications based in artificial intelligence. It will be possible to put a bundle of medieval records into one end of the computer, and at the other to get out not just a transcription, but a full analysis of the texts that make sense of the many links between people and place described within them. Together with Helen Petrie in computer science, a few years ago I led an experimental international interdisciplinary project which proved the possibility of this approach, using English and Latin records from York archives. For the time being, however, we need to use more familiar methods, and we are doing just this in our current project called The Northern Way, the Archbishops of York and the North of England between 1304 and 1405. This project is funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council and run in partnership with the National Archives. Here we are working with a corpus of high-quality digital images of all the records in the registers of the Archbishops of York that have been made accessible online via the website of the Borthwick Institute, thanks to funding from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. In this new project, we're providing English summaries of the contents of all the registers from the 14th century, and also providing online training and workshops for anybody, whether students or members of the general public, who want to get involved in our research and perhaps use this material in their own private study. You can find our website using the link and the email addresses given here. Please feel very welcome to join our project and contribute to our public outputs. I had intended to finish my lecture at this point, but before I do, I want to pay tribute to Anne Rycraft, who has paved the way for many of these digital projects through a lifetime of providing training in reading medieval records to both university students and the general public. Through her Latin group, made up of numerous local residents, she has over the years provided transcriptions and translations of York archival materials to the highest possible standard. I know that a current project of that group intends to make available all the medieval and early modern financial accounts of the York merchant adventurers available in print and in English for future generations. I very much hope that work can be brought to completion. Anne taught me how to read medieval documents, and if there were to be any applause at the end of this lecture, I would like to think that it would be for her and not for me. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Sarah, for a fascinating talk. Now, I think what is going to happen is that the audience have time to ask one or two questions of you. I'm going to act as some sort of compere in the middle and repeat the question which will have been presented to me verbally or in written form, and I will verbalize it for you. To that end, if I can ask, the first question which has appeared is, how widespread among the people was the understanding that the plague was God's punishment? And were the daily masses in that period attended by the laity? Or was the laity mostly just attending Sunday masses?
Thank you very much for the question. Martina, I think you asked the question slightly before I got to the section in my talk where I had an example of a woman from Nottinghamshire who had been fasting for 8 years because of her association with the plague as a punishment of sin. And that's what's fascinating about our current project, where we're currently working through the Archbishop's registers for the plague period, is we're beginning to find more of those personal testimonies of ordinary men and women who do indeed believe, have an understanding that the plague was God's punishment for sin and were acting accordingly. In some ways that evidence is quite rare, but we are finding little bits of it, which is very exciting, and I'm sure we'll find more. We don't have figures for mass attendance, so I can't give you a kind of quantitative answer about attending mass. The laity didn't have to only attend mass on Sunday, they could attend at other times. And we know that very religious individuals, sometimes regarded as eccentric for their religion, were doing just that, were attending mass more than once a week. But also equally many laity weren't even attending mass that often. They might only be attending on the high festivals or just once a year, which was the kind of minimal requirement, if you like. So I think among the laity, you'd find huge variation in frequency of attendance. I hope that answers the question.
Sure, thank you. Can you tell us a bit more about language that is being used and the changes that occurred during the period?
Yes, I mean, the vast majority of these archives use Latin as the normal administrative language in both state and church. There is some use of English, particularly in more discursive forms of correspondence like letters, petitions, chronicles, for example. Did I just say English? I meant French. Sorry, there's some use of French. What's interesting about the post-plague period is you begin to get more records in English, like the 3 that I showed you, that indicates a slight widening in participation, particularly with those craft guilds registering their rules in English. And what interests me, I think, is that as that happens, you begin to get an even more discursive form of writing in the archives. So whereas the earlier archives are often very legal and formal and formulaic, the later records, there's more interest, for example, in recording speech. You begin to get minutes kept of meetings, which is a new form of record that's develops in the 15th century. And you therefore begin to get interest in the politics of speech, in recording arguments, disputes, political protests, and the language that people use, which even, I think, changes the nature of politics. So that switch into English, although it's very slow in the north and much slower than it is in the south, is still very interesting, I think, in terms of its consequences.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Abbey has asked a question. You briefly mentioned the concept of software tools to assess with paleography. Is there work being done on this, and if so, where?
Yes, there are really 2 big elements to that process that I simplified so much. The first is automatic character recognition of medieval handwriting, or indeed any handwriting, and the transmission from it of machine readable text, i.e. the sort of text we're seeing on our screens now. Not much of that work has been done in York, but there are some quite advanced projects in other British universities and American universities, places like Stanford, Oxford, London, for example, that's having some success in generating machine readable text from old hands, whether they're medieval or later hands. But then the second part that we were involved in York, and where I think we were quite innovative, was taking that machine readable text and training the computer through natural language processing and data mining, not just to do simple text searches, but actually to pick out all the relationships between people, place, and dates in a large sequence of documents, and then reconstruct them accurately, both according to chronology and geography, spatial relationships between pieces of property described in title deeds, for example. And when we began that project, I thought that was like trying to land on the moon, but we did in the end make a kind of crash landing. We were actually making it work. So there are two big elements, and indeed even in that later element, there's quite a lot of different separate parts to that. But those were that's the kind of software application that I was talking about.
Thank you very much. Jack has asked, there have been studies done of Milan's success at using quarantine during the Black Plague, limiting the impact of the plague in the city. Was the use of quarantine widened as the plague years progressed? And could this be the reason the plague died out?
It was over decades and centuries. So certainly by the 17th century in York, that quarantine is being used. And for local people who will know, there's a sort of suburban site at Hob Moor near the modern racecourse, where there's a plague stone where food was delivered remotely to people who were quarantining. As far as we can tell at the moment, that does not seem to have happened in this first century of the plague. Although it's very interesting that in that Archbishop's first instruction to hold intercessions against the plague in 1348, he already understood the plague as being an infection of the air. And that was right up to date with modern medical thinking at the time. So clearly there was that understanding, but we don't have much evidence that they acted on it. And indeed, of course, encouraging people to get together for processions is the very opposite of quarantining.
Kate has asked a very interesting and topical question. Have you found evidence in the archives of the use of misinformation, like we are seeing during the current pandemic, for example, in the creation of scapegoats?
There is certainly evidence for that in Europe, in the sense that we know that episodes of plague in Spain, for example, were associated with more persecution of and attacks upon Jewish communities as scapegoats for being sort of responsible in some way for the plague. The Jewish community of England had been expelled in its entirety from England in 1290. So in some ways there wasn't that opportunity. So I'm struggling to think of similar scapegoating in England that is specific. But what is interesting about England in the later 14th and 15th century is there is a growing regulation of immigrants and immigration, not entirely caused by the plague, but coinciding with it. And there is also particularly growing regulation about vagrants, vagrancy, vagabonds, wandering labourers, which is more and more strongly enforced in the 15th century. And you could argue that that kind of increasing regulation of strangers, both immigrants and vagrants are strangers, is a kind of indirect scapegoating at a time of social tension and change.
Thank you. We're nearly out of time, but Karen and Andrew have asked, you mentioned that some documents show that the church were concerned about the approach of the Black Death. Is there any evidence of communities taking steps to prepare for or to prevent the Black Death entering the community?
I think the preparations that I'm most aware of are the ones that I mentioned in the lecture. They're kind of preparations of a spiritual nature rather than a practical one. What we don't know yet, I'd like to know much more about these cemeteries that are being licensed, whether they're being licensed ahead of the arrival of the plague, which seems unlikely at the moment on the basis of the evidence that we've got, or as a reaction to the arrival of the plague. And it may be as we're able to do more work on those sources and perhaps the kind of material evidence for churches and cemeteries in the region, that we may be able to refine that a bit more.
Thank you. Well, I'm afraid our time is pretty well up, so it remains for me to thank you, Sarah, for a fascinating talk, which will have enthused the audience into knowing more about the many manuscripts we hold in and around York. You made me think that in future, when I'm frustrated by some aspect of bureaucracy in the Merchant Adventurers, I must reflect on the thought you have given that very meticulous record keeping brought us into existence and has enabled our longevity, at least thus far. Your discussion of the Black Death leading us to think of parallels and differences between that bacterially derived plague and the current virally induced one is, of course, timely. It leads one to thirst for more interesting tales from the past. To do this, of course, we need access and understanding of what has been written and interpretation in an attractive format for a wider audience of visitors to York today and in the future. So we wish you and the Northern Way project well and thank you and Rycraft, who taught you to read manuscripts, for your stimulating talk tonight. Now, normally, I would invite you and the whole audience to mince pies and wine and refreshments downstairs in our undercroft. Sadly, you will forgive me that I can't do that, but nonetheless, a very good night to everybody.